Israel has finally launched its ground offensive into Gaza nearly 3 weeks after the horrific October 7th terror attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu called it the second phase of the operations. The UN, on the other hand, calls it an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe with over 1 million people displaced in Gaza and thousands killed. But there's also a very interesting maritime aspect at play where over 70 NATO warships are in the Mediterranean Sea. I want to welcome my guest for today, Commodore Srikant Kesnur, a distinguished naval veteran and a naval historian. Commodore Kesnur, welcome to the News9 Plus show.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sandeep. Wonderful to be here with you and greetings to your viewers.
I want to start by asking you about the state of play in the Mediterranean. There are currently 70 NATO warships in that limited space. Tell us what you're seeing and what you make of this unprecedented deployment.
Well, unprecedented in a sense because you got so many, and I think this operates at many levels. One, of course, is an immediate sign of support and assurance for Israel, a sort of saying that we are with you at this time. There would obviously be operational components of that support, particularly in terms of electronic warfare support, in terms of long range patrolling, in terms of having some sort of eyes in the sky and some sort of surveillance. But I would also see it as going beyond immediate support to Israel.
Right.
This is a signal of a global hegemon saying that I'm interested and I'm invested in this area.
Right.
It's a sign of dissuasion to other people, perhaps countries like Iran, not to move the conflict that is there in Israel to a sort of regional conflict. It is a signal from the US to other countries around the world that don't sort of challenge my hegemony. So I think it operates at several levels. The last level is interestingly for me as a Navy person, it also operates, it also works at the operational level, because when you have two carrier strike groups with aircraft flying, you know, this crisis gives an opportunity for the US to also fine tune their operational procedures, you know, getting into a crisis situations.
And the number of aircraft that they've deployed, we were just calculating, it's equal to the air forces of many small countries.
Of course.
It's like nearly 200 aircraft out there.
Bigger than air forces of many countries.
It's certainly bigger than Portugal's air force. Portugal's air force has about 100 aircraft, and here you have like two carrier strike groups moving in. But what is the scenario that you see them kind of, you know, assuming that there are no naval strikes or anything like that? What kind of role will all these aircraft, all this air power play? Will it be to kind of, would it be messaging, or would it be a little more than that?
I guess it would be only messaging if the conflict doesn't spread.
Right.
Because Israel left to itself doesn't need the US Navy to tackle Hamas.
Yes.
It's largely a land. Even if the Hezbollah came in Lebanon, there's no need for the US Navy to come in there. The Israeli Air Force doesn't necessarily need aviation support, and the Israel Navy doesn't need the US Navy to tackle Hamas or Hezbollah. But what the US does is, one, of course, messaging, assurance. Second is, they could also come in handy in case you have humanitarian situations, in case you need airlift, in case you need hostage evacuation. Because let's not forget, a carrier strike group has several organic strengths, several organic capabilities which can come into fore.
Like the LHDs, we were just talking about it. And you've commanded the Jalashwa, which is an American LHD.
American LPD as well.
LPD, yes. How does that function? I mean, you have two LHDs here assisting the carrier strike group. Tell us about the roles that they could play in a crisis like this.
See, the LPDs would also have either ready forces on board or available nearby marine expeditionary forces. So you have a combination of what could be called land forces, you have the naval forces, and you have the air component through the aircraft carriers, and indeed the LPDs or the LHDs. So there's a huge, I mean, this is an armada with Army, Navy, Air Force, everything put together. So, depending on your situation, whether you need the marines, whether you need air support, whether you need gunfire support, or whether you need benign support in terms of evacuation, in terms of hostage rescue.
Right. They've been talking in terms of evacuating all the US nationals from the region around.
Often that is said.
Right.
In fact, if you remember, even when in 71 the
71,
enterprise,
of course,
that was the
incident.
stated reason often, and that could well be that. We must also not forget the huge amount of electronic support. You know,
right.
You have so much surveillance that the carrier strike group gets through its radar, through its EW systems, through its underwater sensing systems.
Right.
You know, so I think there's a huge amount of force there. It is to assure Israel, it is to send a message to the rest of the people that I am still around, and it is to cater for any eventuality. The US believes that it must have ready response forces in the theatre. And this is the theatre at this point of time.
Right. But the theatre primarily has been land focused. Israel's wars over the last 75 years have all been land centric. It's been at war practically for its entire existence. Watch this explainer on how this tiny country has fared in all its wars so far.
At 75 years, this is the oldest ongoing conflict in the world. It's seen 6 full-blown wars and 3 intifadas or uprisings by the Palestinians between 1947 and 2006. The repercussions have been felt far beyond the region and affected the global diplomatic landscape. Today we look at how the Israel-Palestine conflict has evolved and how it has changed the face of West Asia. It all began when Israel declared its independence on May 14, 1948, following the United Nations partition plan of 1947. The Arab world responded with a declaration of war, as a coalition of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq entered Palestine. The war ended in 1949 with an armistice. Where some had believed that a lone Israel would crumble in the face of Arab armies, the war in fact left Israel in control of far more territory than had been allocated by the UN. It was also marked by a significant demographic change throughout West Asia, as around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled Israel. The second conflict involving Israel was not about Palestine. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser embarked on the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which was formerly owned by British and French shareholders. For Egypt, the objective was to remove Britain from the region. For Israel, this was a chance to free up the Straits of Tiran, which would give it an outlet into the Red Sea. In 1956, Israel joined forces with Britain and France to counter USSR-backed Egypt. The war began when Israel launched military operations in Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. The crisis ended with a ceasefire mediated by the United States and the USSR. Egypt retained the Suez Canal with concessions for Britain. Israeli forces were withdrawn, but Israel gained rights to navigation through the Straits of Tiran. The Six-Day War marked a change in the balance of power in the region. It began in June 1967 when Israel preemptively struck its neighbors, the Arab states of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In a mere 6 days, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict and regional geopolitics have never been the same. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, or the October War, began when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. Israel successfully managed to repulse the invading forces. The war ended with heavy casualties on all sides and with the signing of the Camp David Accords. The Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights were given back to Egypt and Syria respectively. The next major showdown would come 9 years later in 1982. Israel would invade Lebanon in an attempt to neutralize the Palestinian Liberation Organization and to establish a friendly government in Lebanon. The conflict escalated and led to a protracted engagement in southern Lebanon. Israel's aims were ultimately frustrated and led to the formation of Hezbollah, a militant Shia organization that still retains power in Lebanon. The Second Lebanon War was sparked by cross-border attacks and the abduction of 2 Israeli soldiers by Hezbollah. In response, Israel would launch a military campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, aiming to weaken the group and to secure the return of the captured soldiers. The conflict lasted for 34 days and resulted in significant civilian casualties. Hezbollah would later declare it a divine victory. Israel saw it as a failure. As for the 2 soldiers who had been abducted, their remains would return as part of a prisoner exchange in 2008.
I'm now joined by my colleague Aditya Raj Kaul, Executive Editor, News9 Plus. Aditya, tell us what the second phase of the war is looking like and break down the war for us, all the phases that have been put out by the Israeli government so far.
Well, Sandeep, so far we've seen 3 weeks of airstrikes mainly. The Israeli Air Force, the IDF, has been bombarding Hamas hideouts. And the main areas which the intelligence of the Mossad, the Shin Bet, has been able to locate, that these are the locations where the command centers of the Hamas have been located. And the second phase, now that has begun already, is including ground maneuvers. And this includes tanks being put inside the Gaza. Over the last 3 to 4 days, we've seen several attempts of incursions inside the Gaza by the IDF, in which through ground maneuvering, they are attacking again these command centers and places and pockets of resistance of the Hamas inside the Gaza Strip.
But are they attacking and then leaving, or are they staying there inside the Gaza Strip?
They are staying there.
Okay.
Initially what was happening, this was during the airstrikes in the first phase, they were actually going inside and then coming back. In fact, our reporters from the TV9 network also went along with the IDF inside the Gaza Strip, but then came back. This time they are taking ration, they are taking tanks and other equipment with the soldiers inside and taking control of that ground position.
Right.
And in the second phase, we'll see these pockets of resistance being attacked.
Right.
And the defense minister of Israel, Gallant, has in fact said that this is the most crucial phase, which will take several months, not weeks.
Right.
And then the final phase would be to create a new security reality of Gaza.
Right.
And that means changing the circumstances completely, eliminating Hamas entirely, and finally taking control of Gaza. But again, there's a catch here, that Israel does not want to occupy Gaza for a longer period of time.
Right.
So what will be this new security reality? Who will govern Gaza will be the big question.
So these are already the questions that are being raised as we speak. So they've already moved in, and you're convinced that it's going to be a physical assault and they will actually retain that territory for a certain amount of time.
There's no other option. I mean, if they actually do these surgical strikes, so as to say, and then leave back, of course, the Hamas has the potential and it has the, the money and the support from Iran that is coming in to actually accumulate a lot of ammunition, a lot of rockets, and a lot of humanitarian aid that is also coming in to keep them breathing and alive, keep them alive all this while. I think Israel has learnt its lessons the hard way. After the killing of the 1,400 people, the Israeli government has realized, and the security apparatus, that they need to create a new reality.
Right.
This new reality means eliminating Hamas as much as possible.
Right. In fact, Aditya, now that you mentioned that October 7th attack, 1,400 people dying, there was a very interesting report in the New York Times today, a very startling report by Ron Bergman and Mark Mazzetti, which said that there were catastrophic intelligence failures. Of course, we knew that there was a big intelligence failure, but they've actually documented that whole thing point-wise. A couple of them are like Prime Minister Netanyahu ignored security warnings. The intelligence agencies literally stopped gathering intelligence on Hamas. They didn't think they were a threat that was worthy of having surveillance and radio intercepts and all of that. And finally, Jordan's warnings were being ignored. Commodore Kesnur, you've been tracking military history down the ages. Intelligence failure has been one of them. When you look at these 5 points where the Israeli military failed, the intelligence apparatus failed, I mean, how catastrophic it is it? Break it down for us.
Very, very catastrophic, particularly because Israel had the reputation of having almost impregnable, very good intelligence system. But even if you leave that fact, for any country, and any country that is circumscribed so much by hostile neighbors or people, so to say, I think these sort of ignorance of warnings, I mean, the takeaways, if what has been suggested by the writers in New York Times is right, it is very alarming at several levels. Ignorance by the top political bureaucratic apex, of what is being given, then not considering someone a threat.
Right.
These are things that you are taking for granted. I found another very important thing, over-reliance on technical intel.
Technical. This is
You
also
know?
a point that they brought out
Yes.
in that. The fact that they
I
were
mean,
so dependent on cameras and
you
all that.
can't, there is no way that you can ever leave human out,
Right.
no matter how technically good you can get. You know, in 71 war, one of the good things that happened for us was that our top leaders knew how the top leadership of the Pakistan would behave. The
Right,
Navy, the
right.
Army, Air Force, because they'd all
course.
trained together. They knew each other. There was a kind of human understanding
Of the other side.
Of the other side, you know, which may not
Yeah.
obtain anymore. So you have to have different ways to have that human now. So, and I think this over-reliance, leaving certain pockets sort of unobserved, happened in
Right.
Kargil, right?
Yes.
You know, so we have had a history in India, we've had history elsewhere.
Right.
You can talk of Pearl Harbor also as being failure
course.
of intelligence, or at least not getting to know the
Oh,
intention.
9/11 is a classic case of
not
that,
getting
yeah.
to know the intention of the
Right,
hostile
right.
or those who are antagonistic to you.
Right.
So I think all these are very, very important, very catastrophic. But we must also remember that adage about intelligence, that it is like the cricket, you know, the batsman has to succeed all the time, but the bowler has to succeed only once.
Only once,
You
right.
know, so someone who is against you has to succeed but once, whereas you need to be
Successful
alert,
every single time.
successful,
Right.
alert, and what you leave out and what you take in, it's far more complex at the working level
Right.
than it would suggest going merely by the headlines.
Aditya, as Commodore Kesnur mentioned, it's been a big blow to Israel's reputation as being that intelligence superpower, if there's a phrase like that. How do you think Israel could overcome this hit to its, brand equity?
You know, historically, I think Israel has been an example as well of overcoming challenges and difficulties. I think this is another one in their kitty, in which they will have to obviously self-reflect, they'll have to introspect, and they will have to in fact wake up to the new reality.
Right.
That you cannot rely, as the Commodore said, that solely on the technology.
Yeah.
As we have reported here on the News9 Plus show,
Yeah.
there have been several warnings that came in from the Shin Bet and Mossad, and that was sent in up the command, chain of command, and they were completely disregarded. They were seen as usual activities of Hamas.
Yeah.
For instance, Hamas terrorists taking pictures
Right,
of
right.
the borderline, trying to see where there could be a possibility to sneak in, or how the balloons were really operating in that area.
Right.
And for the last few weeks, they were not being operated. And there were exercises being carried out by the Hamas terrorists, which were irregular in nature,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, they were preparing to in fact occupy Israeli settlements.
Yeah, in plain sight, and they were exercising in
Yeah,
plain
yeah.
sight, and everyone caught them.
And again, the intelligence agencies thought that this is a usual exercise,
Right,
and there is nothing
right.
extraordinary about it. And the over-reliance, the Hamas and the Iran connection
Yeah.
was not taken seriously.
Right.
They thought that in the Shia-Sunni divide, I think the Shia-Sunni unity
Yeah.
will never be displayed here.
Right.
But the unfortunate, unthinkable has happened, and now I think they will be not only taking precautions,
Yeah.
but I think 100 steps ahead.
Right.
Look at a situation, guard it very pretty well,
Right.
and as the Prime Minister himself has said, that he will create a new reality
Right.
in Gaza. But there are two questions here. One is the security and the intelligence aspect,
Right.
which the respective agencies and officers will look into.
Yeah.
And second is the political responsibility,
Right.
which Netanyahu will have to take one day.
Yeah.
And even though he's a very popular leader, he's been Prime Minister several times, I think it's time that he will have to resign, and
Yeah.
he will have to take the sole responsibility, or else the people will show him the door.
Of course, and this is exactly what happened in 73 as well,
Yes.
Commodore Kesnur. You remember when Golda Meir, she was caught by surprise in the war. And Moshe Dayan, this legendary defense minister, I think shortly after the war, they had to step down. And
They had to. But where I go
retired.
with him is
Yeah.
that Israel has a history, even when sort of suffering initial reverses,
Yeah, yeah.
has the ability to come back. The Yom Kippur War illustrates
right.
that
Their
very
bounce
well.
back
They
is-
bounce
yeah,
back, and their
yeah.
ability to bounce back, I think, is very good.
Right,
If you're doing a pure operational analysis,
Yeah.
you may argue that there's not there's lots of asymmetry between the antagonists, but you're also fighting a asymmetrical war.
Right.
You know, so
And so this is something that they have to do, I think, periodically every decade.
Yes.
They're at conflict, they're at war. There's, they give some, they take some, losses, and that seems to be the story of Israel pretty much over the last 50 years.
It does.
After
it does.
Yom Kippur.
It does. Interestingly, I spent almost 2 weeks in Israel about 20 plus years ago.
Right.
I did a short course. But you see all these, in their papers, and then there is a fair bit of discussion about, we tend to believe it's a kind of very strict, almost Bonapartist thinking singularly. It's
in
not
the military.
so. It's in a military sense. It's not so. There are lots of voices that disagree. There are lots of people who give adverse opinion. In fact, I think that leading newspaper has been critical of Netanyahu's handling Haaretz. So for Israel to sort of at the political and national level to reconcile all this and still maintain that grand national unity that's required. Right. I think that's important, but it's able to do.
There are actually a lot of ways they're very similar to India. They're argumentative democracy. They're
Absolutely.
Quite
Absolutely.
And in fact, the times that I visited Israel, they've told me that, when we look east, the only democracy that we see is India.
True.
Aditya?
Actually, there are a lot of similarities. Right. One similarity is, of course, the kind of criticism that the government has from the media and from
the opposition.
The opposition and the leftist groups all across.
Yes.
I've seen that widely. I visited the Knesset and I've seen how the debates happen there. Even among the right wing, there are factions, and the extreme right is totally against the other right-wing organizations.
Right.
Apart from that, one more similarity, as I mentioned this before also, is victims of terrorism.
Yes.
I was interviewing Mark Regev, who was the advisor to Netanyahu and then later the ambassador to UK from Israel. And he told me outside the Prime Minister's office one day in 2015, when I was accompanying Pranab Mukherjee, he said that, Aditya, we both are victims of terrorism. Yeah. We the Jews for decades have suffered this terrorism, and you the Hindus, he probably meant Indians, have been victims of terrorism in India. So I think there are a lot of similarities, and I'm glad that there is closeness and military as well as trade and strategic cooperation between these countries. But unfortunately, this is a time in history where they will have to look inwards and wake up to the reality. But I again emphasize that even though the intelligence agencies and the security apparatus were ready, for more than a year, their mind was completely diverted towards internal issues. The political chaos that was happening under the leadership of Netanyahu.
Right, but as you mentioned, the fact that India and Israel are victims of terrorism, and that is possibly one reason why India abstained from the motion at the United Nations.
Yes.
Everyone's asking this question, why did we abstain? And we in fact spoke with Ambassador Anil Trigunyath, who's been India's envoy to Jordan and Libya, to find out why. Let's listen in.
India had clearly informed that the terrorism in any form or manifestation should not be tolerated, and this should be condemned throughout. It was not a question of Hamas, but it was generally the precursor. When you are looking at something, it needs to be looked at in a holistic manner as far as this current Israel Hamas war is concerned. So you know that as soon as the attack happened by Hamas against Israeli civilian citizens, Prime Minister had tweeted and conveyed his condemnation on that. Thereafter, when we saw that there was a bomb that killed a lot of people in hospital, in Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza, Prime Minister again conveyed and also provided relief supplies. He also spoke to President Abbas and assured all assistance in the matter. He spoke to President of Jordan. He's King of Jordan. He also spoke to President of Egypt now. India also very clearly articulated its position as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, that there should be the viable state of Palestine, and a two-state solution must be there too. That dialogue, diplomacy, direct negotiations should start at the earliest. Now, all these are there. It is true that there is no doubt that we have a very I should say, a terrible situation in Gaza at the moment. That is because of the bombings that are taking place, and the ordinary civilians are dying and are suffering also. So relief supplies are a must. But you must take into account that India has also directly sent the relief supplies before the people are talking of these kind of corridors, and some supplies have already reached Gaza. So what we are looking at is that the statement which was drafted by Jordan essentially did not include Hamas, in my view, or they did not agree to the Canadian insertion or amendment for the simple reason that if UN General Assembly puts it that the terror attacks by Hamas, then Hamas will be declared as an international terror organization.
Now that very clearly tells you why the fact that you passed a motion, you presented a motion with no mention of the horror of October 7, the terrible violence that had been inflicted on Israeli civilians. Clearly one reason why India stood out of that, abstained from that resolution. But I'd like to come closer home, Commodore Kesnur, and speak about the plight of your former colleagues in the Indian Navy, the 8 Indian naval personnel who've been sentenced to death in Qatar. How has the Navy reacted to this absolutely astounding news last week?
See, I think the Navy chief today on the sidelines of Goa Maritime Conclave once more addressed the news persons and said that the government of India is doing everything, including legal assistance, and will take all measures. And if you sort of combine that with the other developments today, that one, the PM's special envoy has gone to Qatar, and the foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, met the families of the affected. I think not just Indian Navy, but India as a whole has come together in terms of reaching out to these affected families. I would say, one at a personal level, because I know many of these people, and other at a certain, let's say, conceptual level. This is troubling in many ways. One is like the MEA said, it was shocking. Shocking because unexpected for 2 or 3 reasons. One is, personally, I know most of these guys, and espionage would be the farthest away from that. But even if you took my personal biases in this away, it stretches incredulity for several reasons. Espionage is not done by a team of 8-10 people. It's usually done by 1-2 operating, in single groups. It's essentially a cloak and dagger activity, and I don't think you do it advertising it. Second, I don't think this common suggestion that we're doing it for Israel, I think should be nipped in the bud, because Israel doesn't need, we just discussed its int gathering or int abilities. Israel doesn't need India in that region to do any intelligence work. And B, India, notwithstanding a couple of differences here and there, has very close relations with Qatar, So there is no question that India would want to, spy on in Qatar. It stretches logic to me for many reasons.
In fact, that sense of disbelief is what we've reflected in our story on the plight of the 8 Indian naval veterans. Let's take a look.
In October 2023, a disturbing story captured international attention. 8 former Indian Navy officers found themselves on death row in Qatar, sending shockwaves not only through the Indian government but also raising concerns about the state of India-Qatar relations. Why were these individuals detained? What are the charges against them? And what proof has been presented? Questions abound with no answers to be found. This is the case of the Qatar Kangaroo Court. These former naval officers were employed at Dahara Global Technologies and Consultancy Services, a defense services provider owned by an Omani national with connections to the Royal Omani Air Force.
He used to be in a training part. He used to train the Qatar navies regarding how to execute things regarding the ship maintenance and repairs and all those stuff.
And he was in kind of a job where they were directly dealing or training the Navy personnel of that country where they were.
Apart from these 8 officers, there were overall about 120 officers, out of which 90 personnel were of Indian origin who were working in this company. And these 8 people have been arrested. The CEO of the Dhara Global Technologies was squadron leader Hamas Al-Ajmi. He's a retired Oman Air Force officer who has been released just before the Qatar was hosting FIFA 2023. There was another Qatari national, Khalid Al-Ubaidi of Qatar, who also has been released.
The 8 former officers were taken into custody by the Qatari State Security Bureau, the country's intelligence agency. The Indian embassy in Qatar only learned about the arrests in September, and it took until October for the detainees to have their first consular access.
The arrest happened in August 22. When the arrest happened, there was no formal communication. The only formal communication happened after 2 months, if I bring it to you. As you know, that the charges were of spying and they were kept in solitary confinement. The first consular access was in October 22. Now, this prison sentence has come after 14 months and there have been 4 hearings pertaining to this. At the moment, the family does not have any, though family has been given some access to it, and even our counsel have met it, but then the charges are not as of now clear, the documents are not as of now clear.
In this year, in the past 7 hearings, this case has just got closed and they've been given a judgment. So 7 hearings to give a death sentence is absolutely not acceptable, not even understood in the rest of the world. This is unacceptable what has happened.
Within the Qatari system, there is a higher criminal court also, and then there is a, what I understand it, the court of cassation also. After that, they can also seek mercy from the Amir. What I understand is family has already applied for bail and mercy application to the Amir, and that has been rejected.
These were decorated officers and sailors. One of them, Commander Purnendu Tiwari, even received the prestigious Pravasi Bharatiya Samman Award in 2019 for his contributions to strengthening India-Qatar relations. He was the only individual from the Indian Armed Forces to receive this honor. Another was Captain Navteej Singh Gill, recipient of the President's Medal during his time in the academy.
Commander Sugnakar is a NEC 5th course officer and he has done his staff college also. People who are very bright end up doing the staff college Wellington. So he's had a glorious career, and his second innings was also going very gloriously, which has been unfortunately cut short.
But right from his initial training in the Navy, where he was conferred or awarded the President's Gold Medal, the officer has served in one of the most kind of distinguished kind of appointments, the best of the appointments one can kind of dream of. He served on the aircraft carrier, did his command, he served as instructor in the staff college.
They are very meritorious people, very senior people. Any Navy would like to grasp them, get hold of their expertise and use them.
India and Qatar have a rich history of diplomatic ties and economic cooperation. But these ties now appear strained. The families of the naval officers are dismayed by the harshness of the judgment and the lack of transparency and due process in this case. In India, an online campaign has been launched to bring attention to the issue. In just 2 days, over 84,000 people have signed the petition demanding the return of the 8 Indians.
Slowly, the company has wind off its company in Qatar, and the CEO was also released within 2 months of the arrest. And why not these 8 people?
The families, some of the families were there when this verdict was announced, and they, of course, it's like hell broke loose for them when they heard this. Many of them were absolutely not in a position to talk.
When you have such a lot who's holding a commission of the president, you find them that they're working abroad and they get arrested by a Qatari government or a foreign government, which keeps them in a solitary confinement and does not inform their people or even the government of India, is the worst form of violation of human rights as well as diplomatic protocol.
After almost 14 months have passed, you can appreciate 14 months, out of which almost 11 months in solitary confinement. and the people have really taken a lot of physical bashing, and of course the mental effect which you can't see. But yes, these dents have been made. It's a really a tough situation for the people out there, and so there was expectation, there was hope. A lot of hope was given by the agencies who were involved, and since it's a friendly nation, we have good ties. We all were expecting that the outcome will be good, and all our beloved people will come back.
This should be the first and the top priority, because now it is the responsibility of the nation to look after it. What is the future of these 8 families if something goes wrong in these 14 days?
See, I feel that the Indians, with the government, MEA, Indian Navy and the officers' families putting their legal might behind this, they will get fair justice, and they will be back home soon.
In conclusion, the situation of the 8 former Indian Navy officers detained in Qatar remains complex, and questions persist about India-Qatar relations. Diplomatic efforts continue to resolve the matter. What happens now may well set the course for the future of India-Qatar relations.
So Aditya, you've been tracking the story as well for the last couple of months, and I remember in our discussions you said that the MEA was using back-channel diplomacy to work it out with the Qataris. Was there a sense of dismay, astonishment, shock when this death sentence was awarded?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a sense of shock all across, not just the MEA and the Indian Navy, but I think all departments of the government of India, the entire country was really shocked that 8 of our brave soldiers, Navy personnel, will be arrested in such a manner, and the facts will not be presented out in open.
Absolutely.
That what
like
really
happened.
That's,
we were talking about it.
That's a problem. Lack of transparency.
Lack of transparency.
You know, you're
exactly.
not said what are the charges.
Yeah. No charge sheet is
no
presented,
charge
no
sheet.
charges are
And
shown to
suddenly
you.
pronouncing a sentence like this is hugely disproportionate to anything
It's
that
medieval
you think.
almost. Yeah.
It's almost like a kangaroo court that is functioning, you know, like the Pakistani military courts who do not care about the media or the democracy and just charge people to
evidence.
death. Yeah. So this is the first appellate court where this has happened, and I think yes, diplomacy unfortunately is the only way forward here. There have been several negotiations and dialogues that have taken place with the earlier ambassador that was there and a new ambassador to Qatar that has gone in now. I think the United States can play a pivotal role here. It has also close relations with Qatar, and of course we saw with the Taliban, the Doha agreement that happened there itself. With the current crisis, it complicates things even more with the Israel Hamas and the Hamas leadership taking shelter in Qatar. But I think there could be some way out. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any, because they've been still kept under solitary confinement. If the diplomacy had really worked, at least they would have been moved from the solitary confinement to a better cell.
Or even given access, consular access, frequent consular access.
Absolutely.
To
even
Indian
that
authorities, that hasn't happened. So I mean, this is another story that.
Yes, it is. I mean, viewed in this way, it does seem certainly very alarming and something that should pain all of us. Having said that, I'd still like to believe optimistically that our diplomacy plus political capital invested in this, you know, the external affairs statement before now reaching out, I think all of this should hopefully yield a favorable resolution.
I also want to ask you about Minister Hardeep Puri, Petroleum Minister Hardeep Puri's visit to Mozambique. You've been DA in Kenya, and tell us about Mozambique's potential as a gas alternative to Qatar. Is there some subtle signaling here, or is it just regular visits?
It's always good for a country to diversify its portfolio from where it is getting energy, because you must not be held hostage at any time. I mean, I'm just talking of common sense geopolitics. Second, any energy find anywhere has enormous, it's like a honeybee. It's attracting lots of attention from
unwanted
good and the bad players. You know, so the Mozambique, I mean, there are two areas, Area 1 and Area 4, and we are interested in Area 1, where together our companies have a 30% stake. So certainly, and the yield seems promising. There are natural gas reserves there. but you have to find a way to first tap it, then pump that gas,
Pump it and then finally ship it.
make it and then
Right.
shift it.
Yeah.
So, you need a whole lot of infrastructure, from designing the offshore infrastructure for extracting the gas,
Right.
then converting into LNG. I believe they have planning 2 plants, and then having a huge port or arrangements for shifting them on LNG tankers.
Right.
So, that is a lot of work, and you are aware that because of what is called the ISIS Mozambique and the problems in North Mozambique and Cabo Delgado, there was no work there for almost 2 or 3 years.
Right.
So, they are just resuming.
Yeah.
So, the first signs that anything will come out of there is 2 or 3 years from now.
Right.
So, it is not an immediate solution,
Right.
but it is always good for a country to look at alternative sources of energy.
It's very interesting, Aditya, that the gas finds are, it's in 2011 that you find gas off Mozambique, and within 6 years you have a massive insurgency taking place in Mozambique, where guerrillas appearing out of literally nowhere and capturing that particular area. So it's always suspicious how these things happen when there are such massive energy finds, and it leads one to believe there's more than that meets the eye. Do you believe there was something else in this whole game that behind ISIS Mozambique, or was it just part of that wave of Islamist insurgency in Africa?
It could be both. See, 2011 the find was, but 2017-18 was when they got the approval to go ahead and started.
Right.
So,
and 20 is when the insurgency hit the peak.
started. So, now there is certainly an Islamist element to it, because the northern province has bulk of people following the faith.
Right.
They were disenchanted, there is no doubt. And when people are disenchanted, there are inimical elements wanting to take advantage. Right. But please remember that if you actually draw an arc through piracy, through Al-Shabaab, through what's been happening up north in East Africa, there has been the presence of Islamist movements, right there. And they always need alternative sources of revenue.
Right.
So, piracy extracted some, though that was not directly this one. Then the wars gave them some more, and the energy find is like I told you, it's like a honey attracting bees.
Yeah, absolutely. It attracts all kinds of attention.
And then important thing is state capacity to handle this.
Right.
Obviously at that point of time, Mozambique's ability to handle an insurgency and people who are looking at this was limited.
Right.
So, that resulted in
But Mozambique has a very big defense relationship with India. We've been talking to them for many years. Has there been any progress in that? You think there's a possibility there could be Indian boots on the ground at some point?
Indian boots on the ground, $1 million question, because India has essentially been conservative about this.
Right.
We put boots on ground only under UN operations. So, if there is a perceived UN need due to Mozambique, it may happen. But you are right, otherwise there has been defense cooperation, and it has, there has been assistance in HADR, IDI, food aid, but we also have given them 4 Coast Guard ships, two of which were gifted. We have a Coast Guard element training there. There are, I think, 3 MOUs on EZ survey, on hydrographic cooperation, and one more thing between India and Mozambique. So, it is only likely to get more, and white shipping information is the other thing. So, there are many different ways in which you can collaborate, and frequent ship visits, frequent protection of their EEZ, maybe go and do surveys in a couple of their ports. So, there are lots of possibilities of doing it without boots on ground.
Aditya, you ever see India moving away from this policy of deploying forces overseas, not under the UN flag? We've done that only once with the IPKF operation. As India grows in stature.
I am doubtful, at least in the immediate future, that India will do that. There are 2 things here where India has been very consistent. One, of having a kind of a non-aligned policy during wars, where India has taken a very neutral position. In the last 2 years, it's very much visible. One, in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Absolutely.
Secondly, of course, the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas. This has been a consistent policy for decades together. And again, I think boots on ground, it's self-reflective. He said this in greater detail. We are the largest contributors in the United Nations
Yeah.
when it comes to the peacekeeping force. We've in fact made the largest sacrifices as well during conflicts all across the region, in Africa, in other areas as well. So I think that policy will continue. Although the larger question here is the irrelevance of the United Nations, unfortunately, that is there. The biggest recent example being the Israel Hamas war itself, where the P5 has taken completely center stage and these countries are working for their own.
Countries are doing their own thing.
Own interests.
They're pursuing their own interests, and the UN is kind of lapsed into irrelevance.
That the same thing happened 30 years ago during Iraq and things like that. So I guess
UN is always a spectator, it's a bystander, I think, to conflict as
when it comes to serious conflict, probably it is. It's not able to do much.
There are a lot of memes that are doing their rounds. Periodically they're refurbished, and when you look at those memes, the vintage is about 30 or 40 years. Just to tell you how little things have changed. But I want to thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Thank you, Commodore Kesnur, for your views. Thank you, Aditya. We'll continue to track news and developments on the News9 Plus show. Thank you for watching.